Welcome to another episode of the Chronic Comeback podcast. Today, I'm really happy and excited to have on the show finally Rachael Elizabeth, aka Ribeye Rach. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm quite jealous that you're like videoing this outside. I think I need to do that one of these days.
Yes.
Yeah, just for for those of you who don't know, we've been trying to do this interview for. Would you say it's a year? Over a year?
Probably coming up on a year now.
Wow. Okay. Cool. And although Rachel's very nice in taking some of the responsibility, I have to take full responsibility. Like I've been useless, cancelling at the last minute and all kinds of stuff. Unfortunately, that's not the first time I've done that. But yeah. So we're here anyway. So that's what matters. And I think we were talking about it before we started recording. Timing is everything really, and you've made some and we'll go into it, like no spoiler alerts, but like you've made some crazy progress since that time, right?
Yes, definitely. So I think the timing is perfect for this.
Yeah, awesome. So if we could just go back to kind of before all of this started happening for you, like health wise, maybe earlier on in your childhood, what was life like back then, like health wise? Were you a healthy child? Did you, looking back, were there always things that weren't quite right? And yeah, maybe if you could just take us from that point up until the first point of where you started to like get symptoms and things weren't quite right.
Yeah, absolutely. So overall, I had a really good childhood, especially in the early years. And now that I look back, there may have been some minor signs, but I was very active. I was involved in sports and activities in high school and just kind of, I guess, the typical overachiever type. But when I was a teenager, probably about 15 years old in high school, I kind of got sick, and then afterwards just a normal illness, and then I started having symptoms afterwards of more like chronic symptoms of dizziness and migraines. And during that school year, I missed about like half the days of the school year, so I wasn't like completely out for the count. I was still able to be involved in some activities at school and do things with friends, but I was significantly impacted by the symptoms, and we went to doctors and they were having trouble figuring out what was wrong. But after maybe 6 months or so of this, they diagnosed me with celiac disease. And so I went gluten-free, strict at that time. And within a couple of months, I really started to see improvements. So I was doing a lot better. And mind you, this phase of illness was not nearly as severe as it was later on for me. And so I had a couple of really good years, and I went to college and I started rock climbing, and I got really, really into it. And I became a rock climbing coach and just was able to actually like do a lot of traveling for climbing. And I went to Thailand to climb and France to climb, and was also doing school during this. And I think in a lot of ways, I was just really pushing my body too far. I was the type of person that just always said yes to everything. And it was like, it could be a school night and somebody would say, let's go camping tonight. And I would just be like, yeah, let's do it. I'm down, And so that was kind of my way of doing things. And my senior year of college, I started having symptoms after some sort of virus that I had. I was diagnosed with mono, and I started getting really dizzy while I was climbing. And so at this time, I was probably exercising about 3 hours plus a day for about 5 days a week. And so I was very, very active. And at first I started to just notice that like I just didn't have that same energy. And then that turned into lightheadedness and dizziness. And then at one point, I guess my response to this was always just like, oh, I'm just gonna push harder. And I've listened to some of your podcasts. I know that's probably familiar to you. But my response was always, yeah, I'm just going to push through it and it'll just go away. And obviously that was not the best way to handle it. But after, I would say, about 3 weeks of this sort of more chronic symptoms starting, I woke up one morning and I just had a terrible migraine. And this was actually a day that I was going to do a indoor climbing competition. And I went to the competition and I was like, you know what, I'll just give it a try. And as I was warming up, I was just felt so sick and dizzy. And after a couple of warm-ups, I was starting to black out. And I ended up passing out and was like, this whole thing. And after that, it was kind of never the same. And so I did a lot of research on my own in the coming weeks after that. And it was to the point where I wasn't able to get to class. I was having trouble making my own meals and just taking care of myself, the basic stuff. And I actually had a friend who was diagnosed with POTS, and so I was kind of familiar with that. And then I remember looking up symptoms of that, and I was like, that all sounds really familiar. And so I was actually diagnosed with POTS and dysautonomia pretty early on after those symptoms, after just a couple of months. And I thought, as everybody thinks, that when you get sick, you go to the doctor, they fix you, everything's good to go, right? Like, that's what I always thought. I never thought it was going to be some sort of thing that was going to go on for that long. And at the time, I started like a beta blocker medication for POTS, and that actually did help for a certain amount of time for me. And I was able to kind of get back into school, and I was able to sort of do the basic things. But as you know, you can still be pretty sick and functional. And so that's kind of where I was at that point. And I had a couple of good months. I was able to actually start climbing again. And but it was never the same. Like, I was still feeling this like fatigue and this dizziness while I was exercising, but I was really pushing it. And that probably was not the best thing to do. And then the summer hit, and I don't know if it was just the heat or something like that, but I started to get worse again, and I wasn't able to climb. I wasn't able to really exercise. I had just graduated from college, and I and then I kind of started going to doctors again because I was experiencing like a lot more symptoms. My jaw locked up, and I had like a lot of migraines going on, and just like brain fog, just feeling like I couldn't do anything. And I started a desk job after I got out of college, and it was like I could go to that job, but I'd come home and just couldn't do anything else. And the weekends I'd have to rest. And so it wasn't really like much of a good life at that point, but I was still like kind of functional, And then all during this time, I was dating my now husband, and things just kind of continued to progressively get worse. And I went from like working full-time in the office to working full-time at home because I couldn't handle going into the office. Then I went from that to working part-time at home, and then eventually I had to quit my job, and because I just couldn't do it with how sick I was. And it was actually lucky that we had a wedding, and I was wanting to put it off because I was like, I just want to wait until I get better, until we get married. And it was lucky that we didn't, because after we got married, I got a lot worse. And that was when I really started to have like these non-epileptic seizure episodes. And I was really struggling with like the high pressure in my brain. And so at this point, I was diagnosed with intracranial hypertension. And so I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's basically just elevated pressure in the brain with the cerebrospinal fluid. And so I thought, oh, that's the answer. It's like every time you get a new diagnosis, you're just like, this is the answer. And that was at least my mindset at the time. And I actually wondered if potentially my husband's house, well, it was my house once we got married, but we didn't live together until after we got married. And I wonder if the house had mold, because, and it's something I actually hadn't considered until recently, but I was like, why did I just get worse all of a sudden after that? And I realized, I moved to a new place, and there was something about that house that just like, it didn't feel good. And I think that could have been a contributor. But anyway, so we started, I started getting more and more diagnoses. So I was diagnosed with ehlers-danlos syndrome, so genetic connective tissue disorder that's incurable, so-called, which I don't agree with at all. Intracranial hypertension, what else? Chiari malformation, tethered cord syndrome, all these different diagnoses just were kind of racking up. And I ended up having 5 neurosurgeries. And what was interesting was that after most of the neurosurgeries that I had, my surgeon would say, wow, like you were one of the worst cases I've ever seen. Like some of them, like during my tethered cord surgery, he took a picture of my spinal cord. Like, so I'm probably in some sort of neurosurgery presentation now, because he was just like, this is insane. Like, it's so bad. And they kept telling me, oh, you're going to feel better after this. You're going to feel better after this. And I just didn't. And I just wasn't getting better. And they were wanting to recommend more surgeries. They wanted to give me a shunt in my brain, and it just didn't feel right. And about a year after these surgeries, I was the sickest that I'd ever been. I was essentially bedbound. I needed help whenever I was like getting out of bed for anything. And I spent most of my time in a dark room without noise, and just any little thing could trigger me and trigger severe neurological symptoms and pain. Just sitting up, having a conversation with someone on the couch could like trigger these like uncontrollable shaking episodes and seizures. And it was just like, at that point, I was like, I just didn't feel like if I continued going down the route that I was going, I didn't feel like I was going to make it. Like, it was to the point where like I really felt like I was dying. And so I kind of just started looking in different directions. And I know you talked a lot about nervous system regulation in your podcast, but I started to just be willing to consider things that made me uncomfortable, like treatments that sounded crazy, or so-called alternative methods of healing, just because like I was not getting better this way. I knew, any sort of medication I tried, any sort of supplement I tried, just stirred the pot, made things worse, like just wasn't helping. And so I started with acupuncture, and that, like, even at first, like I could only tolerate like a couple minutes of the needles, and that was it. And eventually, after a few months, that like started to help just a little bit here and there. And then we had a neighbor that recommended reading Joe Dispenza, You Are the Placebo. And I remember thinking it was crazy. Like, I read that book and I was just like, this is nuts. People are claiming to cure their genetic diseases through meditation. And I just felt so uncomfortable reading it. But I mean, one of the reasons why I really enjoy your podcast is because you talk about this. You talk about how we need to like be willing to get uncomfortable and be open-minded and learn about things that we're not really used to, or that we haven't been exposed to. And so that was kind of one of my entries into sort of the nervous system healing space. Joe Dispenza's work didn't really resonate with me, but it at least got me like open-minded to the idea of these different methods of nervous system regulation and healing. And so let's see, at that point, I had kind of started doing some meditation and didn't see like a whole lot of difference from it. I know you're familiar with the Gupta program, but I downloaded their free meditation app and I just started doing those meditations every day. And I didn't see a lot of difference from it, but I liked it. And then I then I started going on to more, I started reading more about diet. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Michaela Peterson.
Yeah. That's the lion diet.
Yes. Yeah. So I heard about her and I kept kind of hearing this like popping up, like some people would go on this crazy carnivore diet and all their pain would go away. And I just thought that sounded crazy. Like I wasn't a big meat eater. I had been vegetarian for a while and I just thought it sounded crazy in so many ways. But I started going down all these rabbit holes with the carnivore diet, and I was like, I can't find a single story that's negative for this. Like I really can't. And so I decided to give it a try, and within a few months, like I was cooking my own meals. I was able to be out of bed for several hours a day, and it made a really significant difference in just like my overall energy levels and fatigue. So I really learned about how like the way we fuel our bodies is really important for our overall health. And then a couple months later, I started prolotherapy treatments. So for the instability in my neck, and that helped significantly as well. And then after that, I started DNRS, and that was like a really big turning point in my healing. But anyway, I guess, do you have any questions in regards
No.
to any of
I have loads of questions.
like
No.
feels like talking forever when I don't know how in detail to go with these.
No. I've got loads of questions. I didn't want to interrupt you. So out of interest, when did you come across Michaela Peterson's like that story?
Yeah, so actually several years before I started the carnivore diet, my brother-in-law told me about it. He was like, hey, this girl put her rheumatoid arthritis into remission through this beef diet. And I thought, okay, that's cool. But like, I don't have arthritis. So I just didn't really look into it further and didn't think it would apply to me at that point. But then a couple years later, I heard some people in the Lyme disease community talking about it. And that's when I really started to look into it further. So that was probably about 2 years ago now.
Yeah, no, I only say that because it was I listened to Jordan Peterson's podcast with Joe Rogan. He was talking about her, and then he was talking about how he did it, and then Joe Rogan did it. And then I was like, oh, right, I really want to try this. And then COVID happened, and I was like, what better time to try this than COVID, because I can't do anything else. So, but I kind of like typical me, I did it to an extreme and I didn't really do it right. I was eating I just ate 6 steaks a day for 3 months. And yeah, I mean, I kind of looked a lot better because like it looked like I'd been trimmed down a lot because I lost a lot of fat, but yeah, I didn't actually feel better from it. So I think all of these things is very like individual and specific to that particular person, particularly diet. Anyway, that was just I was interested in that.
That's interesting. I didn't know that you had tried it.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, name most of the things, and I've tried them. But then I've tried. I feel bad because I ate so much meat in a short period of time. But then I was vegan for about like almost a year, so it counteracts it a little bit. So what time period was that from when you first started getting like properly like, oh, this is affecting me on a daily basis, to the point where you first came across the lion diet, the carnivore diet?
That was about 5 years, so quite
Wow.
a bit of time had passed there. And I'd
Yeah.
say the worst, the really like worst of it was probably around 2020 COVID
Yeah.
time. Early 2020 was when things really started to go downhill even further. It's like you think it can't get worse, and then it just can.
Yeah. And, and,
So
and did you, so with DNRS, I feel like with these kinds of things, you need to, I don't know about you, it sounds similar. You need to be exposed to it like a number of times. You know, they say about like being,
oh, absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
like,
I heard about DNRS probably 5 years before I started it.
wow.
And I thought it sounded like such a hoax. And I just saw something about rewiring your brain. I just didn't understand the science behind it. And I just brushed it off. I didn't really look into it further or learn more about it. But like, I was also sharing my just chronic illness journey on YouTube at the time. And I remember every once in a while I'd get comments like, do DNRS, do this. And I'd be like, you're crazy.
Yeah,
But honestly, I do wish, like, in some ways, I wish it was presented in a better way, because I think it's not super relatable for a lot of people. And this goes for like other brain retraining programs too, but like the science behind it is just amazing. And sometimes I feel like it's presented in kind of like a cheesy or cringy way, and that can turn some people away.
yeah,
And
yeah. I think, yeah, it is difficult because then I guess you want to appeal to people who need it explained very simply. Um, so
I think it just depends on the person and the
yeah.
personality and just your situation, whether or not like one certain program or modality will resonate with you.
So, and I was talking about this with someone I recorded an episode with recently. Like, timing is just everything. Like, although you came across it 5 years before, if you'd have tried it, it wouldn't have worked for you because you just weren't ready to believe that that was possible. I imagine
Yeah.
that's me kind of
Yeah.
guessing. But with at that time, how much progression had you made? And do you feel like the brain retraining was just an additional piece to the puzzle, or do you reckon it was the key piece to the puzzle?
Yeah. So at that time, I had made a significant amount of progress. I always like to kind of gauge my progress as a percentage from like 0 to 100, just
Yeah.
because I think, at my worst, I was at 1%. Like, it was just bad. And so even jumping from 1% to 3% could be like massive.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I'd say I probably was like 10% with the diet and other things that I had been trying. And so that was a huge improvement, but it was like I was still really sick.
Mm.
And so honestly, I think at that point I'm a big researcher, so I don't like jump into anything before I know like everything about it. And so I had read lots of books about neuroplasticity, and I'd read Annie Hopper's book, and I had listened to all of these recovery stories with brain retraining. And so I really believed in it when I started it, and I think that helps because I had implemented some of the things that I learned just like from the books that I had read. Like, I had been shifting focus away from symptoms. I had been even just like saying mantras, like before I went to bed. I'd just say to myself over and over, like, I'm healing, I'm safe, I'm healing, I'm safe. And so I think some of those things really set me up for quick progress with DNRS. So when I started the program and started the visualizations that you do with it, I made really, really quick progress. And it was, I would say, probably the quickest progress I've made with anything
Mm.
was from DNRS. But I think I really set myself up for it. And so at that point, I wasn't even able to walk to the end of my driveway when I started. And by 3 weeks of doing, I think it's 3 or 4 weeks of doing DNRS, I walked a mile for the first time. So it was really, really big progress when it came to especially like the dysautonomia and POTS related symptoms. That the brain retraining was like the most helpful thing by far.
And when was that? When was that? Because we were speaking, so it's 2023 now, that we were speaking in, I think, 2022. Had you, at what point in your kind of improvement recovery were you at that point?
Yeah, so when I started DNRS, it was about a year ago now. So
Oh, wow, okay. So
yeah.
so at the point when we were first starting speaking, had you started then?
I'm not sure. If I hadn't, then it would have been around that time. But
Wow,
at that point, I think I had mostly just seen like the improvements from diet and stuff. So
crazy. No, that's amazing. Because and then can you talk about this last year? Because I at the beginning, so I posted like an update like video like for myself, like and showing the progression I'd made, and then you created one, and I was like, holy shit, that's the video you want to see if you're like if you're like wanting to be inspired, because like where you'd come from to where you were. I mean right now skiing is like a, because I still have loads of issues with my joints, like it's still something I know I will do, but it's still something I know I can't do right now. And you were doing it, but where you'd come from was like crazy. Like, can you talk us through that, like that
yeah, so
progression?
at the beginning of last year, up until I was into doing the DNRS program, I still had to use a wheelchair for distances any further than like, I don't know, maybe a block, half a block. So pretty limited with my walking abilities. And um, by the end of the year, I was um, able to go on hikes and go cross country skiing, like you mentioned. And so it was quite. Last year was the biggest year for me in terms of recovery, but I'd say I've been on the upward trajectory for over 2 years now.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you said it like that way, because I was speaking on the same podcast, and I was talking about how I think people get a little bit scared when they hear, me included actually, when I used to hear, oh wow, someone made such quick progress, like that just seems so impossible for me. But for you, you made quick progress at the end of a very long period of like glacial, like slow progress, right?
Yes, definitely. And even like within last year, it was like everything was still gradual, So I'd look back and I would be like, wow, that's crazy. Look at what I can do now and look at
Yeah.
where I was 2 months ago or whatever. But it's still all been gradual. And even at the beginning of last year, I was thrilled with the progress that I had made in the previous year.
Yeah.
And so, like, even just like, because when I was at my worst, I was so sick that, like, I was having episodes of symptoms that, like, literally were an emergency every day. And, like, I just felt so unsafe in my body, like, so, so, so unsafe. And so I think, yeah, I mean, one of starting to feel safe in my body was a really big turning point for me when I started to like signal safety to my brain.
Yeah.
And so and I think that happened, that started to happen as I started to see improvements like with my diet and other things before I went into the more intensive brain retraining. But I think it's all related to the nervous system, even what you eat wires your brain. And so personally, I think the nervous system is the key to the body's innate ability to heal. And there's so many different ways to regulate the nervous system, and one way may work great for someone and not be great for another person. And so I know you've talked about this as well in some of your podcasts about how you've tried certain things. Like I think you said breath work was working really well for you, but that you didn't like feel like you were connecting with the brain retraining or something like that. And I just think that's really cool because it's like there's no one size fits all. Like we all have a lot in common. Like nervous system regulation is so important for healing, but it's not going to look the same for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. And I think that's such a, a comforting thought to think, to know that. And I think the word you mentioned there, like safety, is like a big thing that I've like, safety and fear, a big thing that I've like thought about a lot, and just trying to get a lot less fear in my system and a lot more safety. And that just means like, that can be as silly as like small as just not looking for a threat in everything I'm seeing. So, a menu, someone shows me a menu and I'm like, oh, I can't have that because it's, got sugar in. So I need to stay away from it. Or, I walk into a place that is quite clearly got mold in it, and my brain's not thinking, oh shit, I'm going to be, I'm going to be screwed for like a month. This is setting me
Yeah.
back. And I think it's being able to be, and a lot of that for me has come with, and I've talked about it quite a lot, has come with being a little bit more relaxed about certain things, and therefore not being so like on high alert and being so strict with everything. How do you feel about that? Because obviously, you're coming from, I'm quite lucky in the fact, in comparison to a lot of people, including yourself, that I'd never been like bedbound or like housebound really. I had to quit my job and stuff like that, but never that extreme. When you're that extreme, you must have so much fear that the smallest thing is going to set you back like so much further. So the fear must be
Oh,
even
yeah.
more. Do you?
Absolutely. And especially when you have experienced so much, I guess, failure with treatments and so
Yeah,
many things have made you worse, it's like you are programmed to almost expect that.
yeah,
And that's really hard to let go of.
yeah,
And so that's just been a gradual thing for me. It's not like something that's happened overnight, but even like before I started the carnivore diet and changed my diet, I was terrified. Like I was so scared it was going to make me worse.
yeah.
And so I think eventually I was able to kind of stop doing things out of desperation and fear and start doing them because like I wanted to take care of my body and I believed that I could heal.
Yeah, it's so interesting with like how I look at things now compared to that, like then, in that I was, and if anything, I was being more of like a perfect student in terms of like everything I was doing everything to a T, like every day. But I was doing a lot of it with with a lot of fear as well. And I think what you said there about, I think the biggest difficult, like mentally, the biggest things I've dealt with mentally was the letdowns when things didn't work, and the mindset I would be going into a new treatment, because I'd be putting so much pressure on it, being like, I don't know what I'm going to do if this doesn't work, because I feel like I've exhausted every other thing, and that puts so much pressure on it, and then you're beating yourself up because it doesn't work. um how did you find that? How did you deal with like the letdowns from things not working?
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing, but I feel like I would say the brain retraining really helped a lot with that because it kind of stopped me from I had a tendency to kind of like almost obsessively research things because I just was desperate to find that one thing that was going to help me to heal. And when I started to realize like there's not going to be one thing, like it's going to be a continual process, and um, it's going to take time, and that's okay. When I started to kind of like let go of expectations and just like trust that I could recover, that was a big turning point for me. And I think even just when I started to fully believe that I could recover, that was a huge turning point because for so long I was told like I had these incurable diseases and they were genetic and that I couldn't fully recover, that I'd have them for the rest of my life. And I guess that kind of can become like a core belief. And I when I really started to believe that I could recover no matter what any doctor told me, I really started to see a lot more progress
Yeah,
pretty quickly.
yeah,
And I think our core beliefs have a big impact on our overall physical reality. And letting go of like limiting beliefs was another big thing. Just like letting myself believe it was possible to recover. And I know you talk about this a lot, like instead of, you know, being in chronic illness support groups, listening to recovery stories. That was another thing that was really big for me, was listening to recovery stories, getting away from my chronic illness Instagram account, because I used to have a different account where I shared my chronic illness story. And I can't go on there anymore. Like I go onto that page and I just see people having surgeries and going to the doctor and like so desperate and so sick, and it makes me really sad, but like it's so triggering for me. And I getting away from that environment was really, really good for me. And just following people online that believed they could recover versus people that were just sick and like not believing that they could get better.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Obviously, that's obvious because of the, you know, this podcast, like starting this podcast. Like for me, it was almost like cathartic for myself, like starting this, because I needed to build my own belief in it more. And you know, I still think whilst symptoms remain, it's like there's always going to be that slight like side of you that just like maybe kind of, you know, that voice is always going to be there in all areas of your life. But I think the good news for me is that the large majority of me like knows that all of that stuff is inevitable and I'm on the right path. So did you, out of interest, did you come across my podcast when you were still like pretty sick?
Yeah, I did. I would say it was probably a year and a half ago, maybe, that I did come across your podcast. And I listened to a lot of them, and I really like it sparked something in me. And something that you said kind of stuck with me. That stuck with me was that wanting to heal and being ready to heal are two very different things, or something along those lines.
Yeah,
And I just was like, wow, there's a lot of truth to that.
yeah,
And everybody wants to get better, right? Like that's a given when you're chronically ill. Like that's all you want is to be better. But are you ready to recover? Are you ready to heal? That's a completely different question.
yeah. No, I think I did a like a solo episode where I talked about that. Yeah, the reason why I asked how, you know, were you still sick when you came across it? Like so many people message me, and I always say to them, a goal of yours has to be to come on the show to tell your story. And I think you know, so many people I've had on the show have been people who've recovered. They've not been necessarily, you know, someone who tunes into the podcast. They've not been, or you know, the podcast hasn't been going long enough for someone to be, you know, in the depths of chronic illness and then come out of it in that time. And I feel like you're one of the first people. And I just want anyone listening to this to know that, like, I imagine when you first watched your first episode of this, like, you know, you weren't in your greatest place at that point, and yet here you are now, like sitting outside, you know, having been cross country skiing, hiking, in a position that you maybe at one point never believed was possible. And I think that's just so inspiring to people listening, because I feel like that's very relatable. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just really appreciate what you share, because it's so needed in the chronic illness space. And I mean, because in general, the chronic illness community has a lot of negativity and fear, and that, you know, while it feels good to meet people that understand what you're going through, it in a way it's really toxic.
Mm.
And it can be so damaging to constantly be interacting in these communities where people are complaining about symptoms, they're scared, they're worried about treatments, they're desperate, and everything is about illness.
Mm.
And I just don't think that's healthy. I think it perpetuates the cycle of nervous system dysregulation and illness. And it's just, you know, it's not good. So
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like, yeah, it's unfortunate. I've said it so many times on Instagram. You see those accounts of people who, Yeah, they just get so much engagement because people just feed off that negativity. And they're all good people. They're not bad people, and that's why they're just sick. And it's sad. What life today like? Would you say you've still got a bit of a way to go? Is there anything still kind of there you want to work on, or is it a case of now you just want? For me, I know that for me it's kind of like, yeah, okay, recovery, whatever that is, but it's more like I want to be so much healthier than the average person now. Like I want like a whole new brand of healthiness healthiness that people don't even
Yeah,
exist. Do you know what I mean?
I completely agree. I would say, it's crazy to even say this, but I would say I'm probably about 50 to 60% recovered, which may not sound great to some people, but for me, it's like I'm just so thrilled with where I am, and I 100% believe that I will make it to that 100% or beyond. And I it takes time, to heal, and it's hard to gauge that recovery percentage, especially like when before you got sick, your capacity was just like really so large. Like I was, you know, like I said, I was exercising 3 hours a day most days, and that's a lot, And so to compare that to where I am now, I'm not there yet, But I think in a way, like I I'm hoping that I will be in an even better spot than I was before then, because, I'm learning how to fuel my body properly with food, and how to regulate my nervous system, and to be able to respond better to stress, and just overall, like all of these different natural methods of healing that I've learned about. Like I wouldn't have found those things otherwise. And so I think I fully believe that I will be healthier than I was before I got sick.
Yeah, amazing, and even better, you coming on the show when you're like, I mean, you were willing to come on the show a year ago, and you were
It's funny
considerably.
how like sometimes you feel like you're much more recovered than you actually are, like if you come from such a low place.
Yeah, no, but that's amazing. Like I get it, because I was like completely debating whether to start this podcast, because I thought it would be really triggering for myself, just like to have to constantly, because I get a lot of message saying, are you recovered, how did you recover? And because people just
Yeah.
randomly send me a message and say stuff like that, and it's just like it can be, but I find it a lot easier now. But and I get why people wouldn't want to come on in the middle of their recovery, because it might jinx something, or it might. But so that if anything, that just gives me so much more confidence that your health is just going to go up and up and up and up, because you have that confidence that you're coming on and sharing your story, now, which you should do, completely. So yeah, that's amazing. And I think the way you do your percentages is probably a lot different to the way everyone else does it, because I think in my mind I'm always like, well, 50, if I was at 0%, I'd be like dead. So like I just like I say like, so I think I'm always like, yeah, I've come what I said I thought I was maybe like 75%, 80% maybe. But yeah, but I guess, yeah, when you are bedbound, you are close to 0%, I guess. So
Yeah. Yeah, when you have like basically no capacity to do anything, like it's kind of like a phone on 1%, like the charger is your bed, and I
yeah,
don't know, like you
yeah,
can't not do anything when you're off the charger. But I relate to what you said about like it being hard to sometimes, like hard to get those messages of people asking all these specifics about your journey and stuff. And I think there is an element of like it being hard to share your recovery while you're in the midst of it.
yeah,
And like for me, I think it's had more the benefits and have outweighed the difficult parts of it. But like I sometimes I just have to step away, because it's too much when people will ask, did you have this condition, did you have this symptom? And like it's almost like people are trying to find their perfect match to see if something will help them recover. And I'm just like, I don't know if those specifics really matter.
That,
Like,
yeah, they definitely don't. I mean, well, again, I should always caveat, this is my opinion. Like, I think all those diagnoses like really confuse people because they just go so specific on that diagnosis.
yeah. And
So
it's like they stop looking after they get a diagnosis because they're like, well, now I have an answer.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
that's
even
it.
yeah, agreed. So do you think you're in a position now where, I know I always ask people like about gratitude, whether they, because I know, and for a while now, there's so much I can be grateful for what I'm going through, but what I've been through, because of how my life is today compared to how I believe it would have been. Are you able to do that now? Like, and if so, like, what areas of your life are better as a result of what you've been through?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely feel like I've went through what I did for a reason, and I think it's in a lot of ways has made my life better and just helped me to appreciate like the little things, even just like going for a walk every day. I'm still like, wow, this is awesome, and um just being able to appreciate those small things is such a blessing, but also the things that I've learned about optimizing health and taking care of your body and fueling your body right with the food that you eat and all of those things. Like, I'm grateful that I learned those things because honestly, like, I think the way I was going, like, and the way most people are going, like, they're gonna get sick eventually, like, and I think just with the hustle culture and the way people eat and the toxins in our environment, like, it's a ticking time bomb for pretty much everyone. And so if we don't learn about those things, then we're probably going to get sick. And so I'm grateful that I know what I know now, and I think it's something that hopefully I'll be able to pass on to children if I have children in the future. And um, it's a huge blessing. So
Yeah,
yeah.
awesome, cool. And then finally, it wasn't that long ago that you were in a pretty bad way, and I imagine mentally that was quite difficult for you. What would be your advice to someone who's kind of at that point right now, who's kind of trying to figure a way out and can't really see the wood from the trees?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say if you're in a really difficult place right now, just if there's anything that you can do to just let yourself believe that recovery is possible for you, then that will be huge. And I know a lot of people will ask, like, how do I do that? But like, just let yourself even just like consider the possibility, like plant the seed and go from there. So many people are recovering from chronic illness. Like, my story isn't unique. That's what I always like to share. Like, my story isn't at all unique. So many people are recovering. It's possible, and you can recover. So
Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much for coming on, and it was definitely worth the wait. I'm glad I was so disorganized that I messed this all up that you could interview today. I feel like the universe conspired for that to happen. So yeah, I'm very grateful that you were patient with me.
well, awesome. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. Really enjoyed chatting with you.